Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Corey, and I am with Book Soup. And tonight we have the pleasure of hosting Natalie Eve Garrett discussing The Lonely Stories with Gabel, Maggie Shipstead, and Lev Grossman. Before we get started, a little bit of business. So if you have not purchased your book, you may do so by using the little green button or tab at the bottom of your screen. You can do that at any point during the event. And also, if you have a question for any of the authors, you may put that in the Ask a Question tab, also down there at the bottom of your screen. The last 10-15 minutes or so we'll use for the audience Q&A. And okay, let me introduce the guests. Natalie Eve Garrett is an artist and a writer. She is the editor of The Lonely Stories. Lev Grossman, Maggie Shipstead, and Gabel are all novelists who have shared their personal essays in The Lonely Stories. So let's turn our ears on and listen to these lovely writers and hear about this amazing book.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to Book Soup for hosting us. I feel like there's such poetry in doing these virtual events to celebrate the lonely stories, when we're each alone, but also kind of connecting through that aloneness. So thank you all for being here. So The Lonely Stories, it began with a question that was inspired by Ross Gay's Book of Delights. And he writes, what if we joined our sorrows, and what if that is joy? And while working on The Lonely Stories, I kind of rephrased that in my mind as, what if we joined our loneliness, and what if that is joy? When I was a child, I actually spent kind of a lot of time alone. I was often sick. I had chronic sinus infections and anxiety and undiagnosed migraines. And often really there's no real cure per se. It was just kind of like sleep it off, spend time alone in the dark until, I healed. And as a result, I really empathize with the loneliness of isolation. But at the same time, I feel like all of that alone time for me was kind of a wellspring of creativity. And now, as a painter and, an editor and writer, I really kind of seek out that solitude and alone time and really relish it. So I love the idea of kind of conjuring a book that would tease out the ways in which alone time can be both, utterly maddening and also a source of joy. For me, I think exploring and, acknowledging vulnerabilities, including, anxiety about being alone, can be a stepping stone, I think, to the joy that comes from catharsis and from relief. I'm not the only one who feels the way I feel. So, this is a collection of 22 personal essays, illuminating from celebrated writers, exploring the experience of being alone. And I embarked on it well before the pandemic in 2019, but much of it explores, kinds of aloneness that existed long before and will continue to exist, in the wake of the pandemic, should that ever come. But for me, in the wake of living through this period of collective isolation that we've all been through, to some degree, I feel like the premise really resonates even more strongly. So I hope that that's the case for the reader as well, and that that they find the stories as kind of unlonely as I really do. And with that, I would love if each of you might be game for reading a bit from your essays. I don't know. One of you wants to jump in. Maggie, do you want to go first? I think your essay
Sure.
Book,
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but writing this kind of I can't remember the exact timing, but it was fairly early in the pandemic, I think, and then kind of revising throughout. And the essay feels a little bit like a time capsule. I'll be curious, like Lev's is further in the past and Asia's also was, anyway, so mine sort of jumps all over the place throughout my life and different experiences with loneliness. But this comes at a part where I'm talking about brushes with death. And I describe an experience I had scuba diving where after I finished, I got a horrible migraine and then a rash on my torso and pain in my joints. So here we go. Later, I realized I'd been experiencing a mild but still excruciating case of decompression sickness, or the bends. The bends happen when the nitrogen that accumulates in your blood during a dive doesn't have time to be safely exhaled, usually because of a rush descent, and instead bubbles out through your tissues. The consequences can be severe, even fatal. Divers like to think the bends are 100% avoidable if certain rules are followed, that only the incompetent are at risk, but that's not true. Your odds of decompression sickness can be drastically reduced through careful dive practices, but unpredictable physiological factors are in play. For instance, 20 to 25% of people have a perforation between the two atria of their heart that, for most, causes no ill effects, even when diving. But for some, and I suspect probably me, correlates both with aura migraines and increased chances of decompression sickness after moderate, benign dives. That sometimes mild symptoms become abruptly, dangerously worse if untreated. Breathing oxygen may help. A trip to a recompression chamber might be necessary. My symptoms happened to get better on their own, though my body felt bruised and sore for days. That night, I sought out the dive master and explained what had happened. I told him I needed to cancel my dive for the next day. He insisted I was wrong. The dive was perfectly safe, he said. Your problem is something else, but if you don't want to dive, that's up to you. I hesitated. I hate feeling like I'm being cowardly or weak, like I'm a child again, cooking up some far-fetched excuse to get out of PE. To dive again the day after an incident of the bends would have been exceptionally dangerous. Still, I felt myself genuinely considering going down again. But why? Just to prove to this man, this stranger, that I wasn't a wimp, whatever that meant? If anything, I was more likely to end up proving to him catastrophically that I'd been right. Still, there would have been something comforting in agreeing that, yes, I just had sunstroke, yielding to his dive expertise, following along. I felt suddenly hopelessly lonely. I couldn't take what had happened in my body and make it concrete and visible. I couldn't hold it in front of his face as proof. The pain was mine alone, as was the decision about what to do next. I knew he and the doctor thought I was being hysterical, and the fact that they were wrong didn't stop me from feeling embarrassed, even ashamed. I don't think I should, I said. It's your choice, he said, shrugging.
Thank you. So good.
I can go after. Sorry, my dog's having a crazy moment over there. I can go because that was so lovely, Maggie. And it reminds me of what I was feeling when I wrote this essay, which is called The Body Secret, which is essentially about how lonely it is for everybody to have a body and to not be able to really communicate what it's like to carry your own body around in the world. And what got me thinking about that when Natalie approached me was that I was very pregnant when I wrote and was revising this essay. And before that, I had had a miscarriage. And so I was thinking a lot about my body and how horrible and wonderful it is to be privately inside of it. So I'll read a little bit from the beginning of that essay. The first time I was pregnant, I didn't understand that it was supposed to be a secret and that therefore I too was a secret. After some months of trying, I found out I was pregnant in early March, and I celebrated with my husband in all the ways you're supposed to. We took pictures of the test sticks, cried, fought about eating raw cookie dough, made a list of absurd baby names, and stared at my stomach, willing it to grow. I called a few close friends and told them 6 weeks and was met with hushed tones. So early, they said. I told them I wasn't one of those women who was going to keep it a secret from them because if something bad happened, I would tell them that part anyway. Isn't it better to have someone with you on the journey than to suffer the bad news alone? An app gave me size comparisons, and they were as silly as everyone said they would be. Your baby is the size of a pea. Your baby is the size of a pumpkin seed. What the app didn't say, your baby is so small, if you held it, it could slip through your fingers. It didn't say, if you lose a pumpkin seed, don't tell anyone. When my dad died of stomach cancer at the age of 62, my mother warned me not to tell anybody. She said it would look bad, him dying at that age instead of in his 70s or 80s, as if we had done something wrong or didn't try hard enough. But when you're 21 and a senior in college, no one asks you why your parent died or what it looked like. So I stored those details in my head and walked around campus with them, marching toward my future. Only once did they come tumbling out during my first ever panic attack on a street corner before midterms. Everyone thought I was freaked out about my Ulysses exam. The summer before my dad died, I moved home and spent syrupy, warm California afternoons with him. My dad had been a carpenter on construction sites all his life, and I'd never known him not to be doing physical labor. That summer, though, we lazed. We sat on the couch and watched the Ellen DeGeneres show. Sometimes we saw cheap Tuesday matinees. Sometimes I made him smoothies, which he only drank half of while we read books side by side. Sometimes I drove him to chemo, where we cheerfully talked of anything other than the poison coursing through his veins. But those late afternoons on the couch, sometimes I would lie down while he sat, resting my head on his chest and his stomach. He had a big Santa Claus belly, though in his post-cancer life it shrank. We watched Ellen dance in the audience, and I listened to the steady beat of his heart. You might think I did this to comfort myself, to hear evidence of his aliveness, but it only scared me. There beneath my ear was the sound of the fragile mechanism keeping my dad alive, a muscle that at any moment could decide it's had enough. I heard the hush of blood, the creaking of veins adjusting to the work of living. There it is, I thought. Not evidence that he was alive, but evidence that what was keeping him alive was awfully tender, a mere viscous wish beneath his bones. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, it must mean it's my turn. I was. I guess there's no avoiding the inevitable. I'm going to read a short passage from my essay, which it's an account of a period of 6 months or so that I spent living in Maine, not long after I graduated college. When Natalie told me what this collection was about, I already knew that this was the essay that had to go into it. It took some time for me personally to accept that I was going to put this essay in there, because it was a very painful and still embarrassing period of my life. I'll read you a short bit of it, and you can just imagine that it only gets worse after this. So I moved to a farmhouse in a small town in Maine, where I didn't know anybody, because I thought it would be a good idea and that I would get some writing done. I was really wrong on both those counts. It was my first experience writing full time, and I could do 5 or 6 hours a day, but that still left me with a lot of unarable time to dispose of. So I took a lot of walks. I explored the area around the farmhouse. I can still see it with cartographic clarity from above, like the map of the 100-acre wood in Winnie the Pooh. Turn left on the dirt road and you got to a creepy one-room Pentecostal church with boarded up windows. Turning right took you over a concrete bridge above a little dammed creek, which I used to toss little sticks into. Beyond the bridge and the creek were the empty but surprisingly well-appointed grounds of a summer camp for disturbed teenagers. When I didn't walk, I drove. I listened to the radio. It was the fall of Prince's Diamonds and Pearls and U2's Mysterious Ways, 2 perfectly decent songs that, through no fault of their own, I never, ever want to hear again. Back behind a local pharmacy, there was a room full of arcade games, and I spent hours in front of an obscure but compelling side-scroller called Heavy Unit, in which you piloted a 2-dimensional ship armed with lasers and bombs through a hostile and ultimately fatal cavern. I have never seen another instance, by the way, of heavy unit. I have never seen another heavy unit cabinet anywhere. It makes me feel like I dreamed the existence of this game, but it probably existed. I spent a lot of time at the library, although it turned out that none of the librarians were lonely. But I was lonely. It was the first fall that I'd ever spent out of school, and I'd never been that isolated before. Loneliness was a different animal back then. There were no cell phones. There was no texting, no Facebook, no Twitter, no email. Long distance calls cost money. The web had not even been invented yet. I had to get my pornography in the form of magazines. You can still be lonely now, but back then it had a different texture to it. It was raw and uncut and feral. I'm gonna leave it there. The downhill slide continues.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you all so much. Oh my gosh, it's so different to hear it in your voices than in my voice in my own head as I'm reading it a million times. I would love to hear what your reaction was when you first received my invitation, which Maggie sort of started going into a little bit, because, well, I don't remember actually if I wrote you in 2019 or in 2020. I think just my memory of the before times has just warped to such an extent that it's hard for me to remember. But I'm curious, whether or not I wrote you in 2019 or 2020. Well, at least for you, Maggie, and for you, Asia, I think much of it, if not all of it, was written during that first pandemic year. And, I'm curious what that felt like, I guess, and, what it felt like to receive the invitation and then maybe have things change, or also if you knew what you wanted to write about immediately, explored that before. I know, Maggie, we talked a little bit about that, or we corresponded about that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was 2020. I kind of think you caught me at that moment when I was like, well, kind of didn't have a ton to do.
Was it pandemic 2020 though, or like before?
Yeah,
just before it was?
I think we were in it. And you sent a few examples, and Lev's was one of them. So that was one of the first. The detail of the pickles in the basement will haunt me forever.
I was gonna say, yeah.
It's the only thing anybody ever remembers about that.
I love that part. No, I remember the whole thing, but I love that part.
Yeah, and I connected to a lot of what he was writing about because I'd also spent time alone writing, sort of more accidentally than purposefully. But I think too, part of what interested me about the idea or the subject kind of in that moment was that I sensed, even though it would have been really early into sort of lockdown and isolation, I sensed that my relationship with aloneness or loneliness was going to evolve. And I'd spent, huge amounts of time alone in kind of the 6 or 7 years that I'd lived in LA, starting in 2014. I travel alone a lot, and I'd sort of become, it's in the essay, but I'd become sort of inured to loneliness in a way because I did spend so much time alone writing, and it became sort of a source of strength and almost of pride. And but then suddenly everyone was having to be alone. And so I was having to sort of call on my loneliness skills that I'd built up, but it was also in this completely different context. And I thought one thing you said in your introduction that was so interesting was that there can be sort of shame attached to loneliness. And I really felt that, just to be generally fine with aloneness and solitude, then it feels like if you admit even for a minute that like I'm lonely in an unhappy way, people are going to be like, see, told you, like you were wrong about all this. You need to change the way you're living. And it almost feels like you have to keep up this perfect front. But then I think you and I did do some corresponding on what I would write about. And this sort of was cobbled together out of different things I was thinking about.
I remember with you specifically that you at first, and like you were maybe your second, you mentioned something having aversion to the topic, but sort of reluctance or something. But then because you had that reluctance, that was a signal that you should do it. You said something like that.
Yeah, that is true.
I loved it.
You're breaking up a tiny bit, but yeah, I think I worried, and maybe rightly, this is probably the most personal essay I've written, and I generally don't mind writing them, but then to like really get into it, which I knew I would have to do because a different idea wasn't really presenting itself. I felt a little trepidatious about the sort of what would be necessary to reveal, but you know, as these things go, then you write it down and it doesn't rise up and murder you. You just move on. That's fine.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah, it did feel so scary to write about. It feels scary to write about loneliness. I mean, writing is itself a terribly lonely activity. But I hadn't been doing, like Maggie, I maybe hadn't been doing much of it in the pandemic. And all it felt like I could think about was being pregnant, not being pregnant, being pregnant again. So your invitation gave me a really great opportunity to write about that, which I don't think I would have otherwise, because I wasn't really connecting writing with the sort of emotions that I was going through. Because when you're pregnant, for the first part of it, it's very secret and you feel horrible and you can't tell anybody. And then in the later part of it, it's so public. You become public property in some ways. And, but what's happening inside you is so insane, exponentially insane. And so it has an effect of making you go pretty deep inside yourself. And so I was really grateful, but I did feel like Maggie in that, you know, it's scary to write about your you know, the stuff that you're not supposed to tell anybody, I think, especially for pregnancy. But I mean, in general, like, you know, it felt really, really vulnerable, but it's nice to read them all together to know that that's not just me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm glad that it has that effect. But did the act of writing it sort of feel like, you know, like taking off a lead and vest?
Yeah, like I don't think I had articulated any of that to myself really until I wrote it, as I'm sure everyone here knows that's why you write sometimes, is to find out what you think. So right.
Yeah, in some ways it was such a clear example of that, because we're really close friends, and I knew when you had the miscarriage, I knew when you were pregnant the first time, but then reading your essay brought so much more, I don't know, it gave me so much more, which I was so grateful to have. And it's true, there's something different about having to process something on the page than sort of casually in your social life.
Lev, was this the first time that you wrote about that time so long ago?
I had taken it. It took me quite a few attempts to tell that story. The particular essay that's in this collection, I had written an earlier version of that ran in BuzzFeed. But I found when I returned to it, I found that I was dissatisfied, and I rewrote it for this. It is extraordinarily what comes out when people are alone. I think that anybody who had the misfortune of knowing me when I was in college, probably, you know, I had like a standoffish kind of, like, I'm a cat who walks alone kind of thing, because I wanted everybody to think that something cool was going on with me, which it wasn't at all. But I really believed that when I went off and isolated myself in this way, that there would be this wonderful, I don't know, efflorescence of creativity. At last, you people can get out of my face and I can really get some work done. And the crash that occurred was it was immediate. I realized that I was forced to confront that I was so deeply dependent on having other people with me. I leaned on them so hard, and I always thought that they were leaning on me. And I was so wrong about it. And I found it humiliating. I think it took me years to process what had happened, and to sort of work through the shame. There was a lot of shame associated with it, partly because it was just such a stupid mistake. And how could I have known so little about myself? When I was not old, but I was old enough to know better, except I didn't know better.
Do you think, though, now, like looking back, given that it happened the way it did, like it must have in some ways accelerated some sort of learning curve? Like if you hadn't gone off and done this, you probably would have always thought, well, if only I could get to some village somewhere,
It's true. And it's sort of how soon they forget. When the pandemic began, I had like a lot of people, I was confined in my house with my family. And my kids couldn't even go to school, so I was homeschooling them, and we couldn't get away from each other. It was like Sartrean, the confinement. And I found myself thinking so fondly of the time when I was living in a farmhouse in Maine, and I used to squat in the basement and eat pickles and drink Ailey's Irish cream in the dark. I mean, I was like, I had to learn all over again, remember that was not what I need. And actually what I needed was to be here with my people. But one forgets and has to remember. I guess that's just, you have to learn that over and over again.
Yeah. I felt like too, during early pandemic, I thought, not like, oh, great, but like, well, at least like to find a silver lining, I'll get lots of work done because nobody will be around to talk to me, because I did write, a lot in the past in solitude. I wrote kind of my first 2 books when I was totally by myself. But then it was just like the absence of stimulation was so oppressive. And it was kind of what you're describing. I felt like I didn't understand that even just small human interactions, like taking my computer somewhere outside the house to work, that sort of thing, was really essential. I thought it was sort of, also small impediments to the perfect solitude that would be the perfect writing environment. Of course, like there's also crushing anxiety and the tragedy of the virus. But it was really surprising to me how that total vacuum was not at all conducive to creativity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it makes a difference when we don't choose the alone time, like it feels more lonely when it's, foisted upon us than when we say, okay, I'm choosing to, go off and be alone. I'm curious, I'm going to go out of order because we were talking a little bit about the role of solitude and creativity, because it sounds like, I don't know, to some extent, it seems like you're saying you have different feelings about it. Like Asia, you mentioned that the act of writing, I think you described it as being profoundly lonely, or at least you used the word lonely, but I don't know. I'm curious because, art making in general requires alone time. And I don't know. I mean, I feel like for me, maybe this is like the key distinction, but I feel like for me, when I'm going to say when I'm painting, but although I have not been doing enough painting lately, but when it's working, when it's going well, when I'm, really in it, then I feel really just completely unlonely. And it feels like, I'm creating connection, whether it's, to anyone else or just like to color. And it feels like connection, but then, when it's not working, it just feels really lonely and like kind of pointless. And I don't know. I feel like I struggle to find the right balance there personally, but maybe that's just how art making is. And it kind of oscillates. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Is that kind of solitude enriching for you? Is it ever?
I think that having a child put that into sharp perspective for me. I'm so rarely alone now. And that was not something that I was prepared. I was prepared to be tired, and I was prepared to be, mostly tired and in pain. But it didn't occur to me until like 3 and 4 months in where I was like, I'm never alone in my apartment anymore. And I do think it's so valuable to be alone with your thoughts, to be able to see where they go, and to have trust in them. I've found that, like, over time, if I don't do that, if I don't practice that, then I start to lose faith that there are thoughts there. So lately I've had to create a structure and go to a place outside of my home to work, which has been really helpful. But, I also write in TV rooms, which is the opposite of lonely. And it's so collaborative and so full of talking. And that's a different kind of, that is art making.
Right.
But the same, if it's going really well, the same sense of connection is there, where it's like sort of the idea is feeding itself and it keeps getting longer and longer. And so I don't necessarily think that you have to be alone. I just think that for the kind of creative thinking that I seek out to write books, that I do have to be alone.
Yeah.
There's something too about the play of being in company and being in solitude. Something I find strongly is that writing for me a lot is about saying the stuff that I can't say to other people in conversation, and it's helpful for me a lot to be with other people and to be chatting and being social, and then I'm very conscious of the part of me that I can't talk about, that I can't articulate or put across. And for me, so much of fiction is about putting that stuff across that you can't say at a cocktail party or whatever. So I'm reminded of that, and then I have to run off, and so I'm going to write the stuff down that I couldn't express, and then I forget what that is, and so I go out and I'm reminded all over again the things that are hard to say to other people. So going back and forth for me is I guess very productive, but all one or all the other is just unmanageable.
Yeah, and I connected with what you were saying, Natalie, too, about how when you're actually sort of in the flow of it and in the act of making art and it's working okay to good, then I do think that does sort of stave off loneliness. It becomes sort of a substitute for sort of life with other people. Like, it's in my essay, but when I was writing my first book, I was 25 and I spent 8 months on Nantucket through the winter. And I'd been there a couple times before, but like in the shoulder season or high season. And so I was like, I'm going to go there. I'm going to write this book. It's sort of like Lev's setup, slightly less catastrophic results. But I assumed I would make friends. I just thought, I usually make friends, and I just did not. And so I went, 5 weeks without having a face-to-face conversation with someone beyond buying groceries or something like that. And it became a great way to work in a way that for some reason the early 2020 wasn't, but it was, during the day, the time I spent focused on this novel and with those people, I wasn't conscious of my solitude. And it was the sort of other parts of the day that got weird. Like, I had a very rigid routine involving what I ate and when, and I would get really anxious about basic tasks, like taking my trash to the Nantucket dump, which is pretty simple. You drive into the dump and you put your trash in the trash pile, but I had to psych myself up to go. I was like, I'm going to do it wrong and everybody's going to laugh at me and they'll know I don't belong here. Like, I just sort of, where your anxiety sort of ends up falling when you're alone, I think can be a little bit unpredictable too.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, your essay touches on so many interesting, there's a lot going on in your essay. You touch on everything, but yeah, the loneliness of shame and of embarrassment are things you were just kind of alluding to. It's extremely relatable. I'm curious, so do you have kind of a favorite place to be alone? I mean, you have maybe less preferred places. but or I mean,
Me?
alone for yeah. I mean, favorite places to be alone, maybe for writing, but also in general, like the place, you seek out solitude.
Yeah, I like to hike by myself, even though there's always a little tinge of danger, kind of regardless of where it is.
Right.
I mean, I think being home alone is really delicious, especially now that I live with someone. When I wrote the essay, I had only lived alone, and now I don't. And he's usually way over in his office, but like even when he's gone for the day, I'm like, there's a different quality to it, and it makes you feel. I don't know. I feel like I'm a kid again in some ways, kind of left with the run of the house. And I've really enjoyed traveling alone. I think I've had a lot of good experiences, just because they aren't in any way mediated by another person. You're not responsible, as in the essay as well, along with everything. You're not responsible for somebody's moods. Just everything you see is sort of, you're sort of responsible for how you process what you see. And I've enjoyed that a lot in many different places.
I'm rarely alone, but I take special delicious pleasure in hotel rooms of any kind, even if they're terrible hotels. I was on a book tour not long ago, and I was booked into the worst hotel I've ever stayed at. I mean, really crazy that these places exist. I'd never been anywhere quite like it. When I got there, my first thought was, I'll sleep in my car. I'm just gonna leave the tour and go home. Like, I can't be in this place where I am. But I came to love it. Just
we need visuals.
Where was it? I need more.
Deep in working class suburbs in Massachusetts, a chain hotel. For legal reasons, I probably shouldn't cite the exact establishment, but it was a 1-star establishment. There was all the stars. There were just one lonely star. But I was booked there for 2 nights, and I came to really relish it. Now I feel again nostalgic for that. Just those 4 cheap walls. There was something kind of wonderful about it. It was like being in a little, I don't know, orbital spaceship or something.
I love the beach in winter, and I don't know if that's, my dog is not happy, but I don't know if that's because I grew up in Sonoma County, going to the beach in the winter. It was always cold there. I spent a while in Provincetown in winter. And there's something about, especially beach towns in the winter, where like Nantucket or perhaps Maine, where the pressure of tourism releases, and you feel like you're at the end of the earth and the end of the world, and so the pressures of a lot of life releases, like answering phone calls or emails and things like that. And so I like to go vacation places like that in the winter. Helps me feel disconnected.
Nice. There's a movie that reminds me. Have you seen the movie Ruby in Paradise?
Mm-mm.
It's real. I think you'll like it. You should write it down. I'm going to email it to you.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's from a long time ago, but I remember watching it as a teenager, and it's a beach town. I think it's Ashley Judd, although I'm really bad sometimes with actresses' names, so I hope I'm not saying that wrong, but I think that's who it is. And
I was thinking of the scenes on, I think it's in Montauk in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Not a movie that I loved every moment of, but the winter beach scenes were very vivid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Ruby in Paradise, the whole movie is just like, it's really quiet. Like hardly anything happens in the movie. It's just like this hush. I don't know. I sometimes like movies like that. It's like a preferred genre of movies.
Movie version of being alone.
It's just like really soft, and yeah, it kind of is. I think I did watch it. I probably did watch it alone in my teens. Yeah. Now I want to go do all those things, stay in a dingy hotel and, go snorkel, go to the Maldives. But yeah, that's not happening anytime soon. Neither of those things are happening anytime soon because it's like still kind of a pandemic. I don't know. Like, yeah, my kids are in school now, so there's that. But then I don't know. I mean, there's like always the possibility, the emails are coming in faster now, the possibility of class quarantines and all of that. So yeah, alone time has definitely been diminished for me, and I miss it.
I would definitely cite the moment after drop off as a special alone time that I really cherish. There's nothing else like it. It's like a drug. It just feels so amazing.
My kids get picked up by the bus, and then I have my trek down, but I'm usually at the bus stop with my dog, which I don't feel like as alone when I'm with I was thinking the other day, like I'm never alone anymore because I'm always with my dog is always with me, even on walks. And I was thinking I miss that, just being alone in the woods. But I do love my dog, so it's okay.
Things got weird with my dog on Nantucket too. We sort of became more like equals. Like there was an armchair that we both wanted to sit in all the time. And it was sort of like whoever was there first, the other had to respect it. So if the dog was in the chair, I'd be like, well, maybe tomorrow.
Oh, your dog is so cute. My dog does not go on the chairs. So
this was a previous dog. This dog stays on the floor. He's too enormous for the furniture.
Another thing I noticed when I'm alone for a long time is reading becomes extremely intense. It really does. In a good way, mostly in a good way. I mean, I have had experience. I rarely dip into reading horror, but when I have had bits where I can't turn off the lights when I go to bed. I just have to sleep with the lights on. It becomes very intense, and sort of dangerous. The story leaks a little bit out of the book into the room that you're in, and you can't kind of stuff it back.
Yeah.
It becomes very heightened and powerful in good and bad ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm like that a lot of the time when I'm at least if I'm really into the book, I'm kind of always like that. I mean, I guess if I'm not as into it, then I'm not. But I can't read horror. Like I would just be having panic attacks all night. It would not work. I'd never sleep. Sleep is fraught enough already. But yeah. No horror for me. No horror stories in the lonely stories. I don't think. I'm trying to.
Natalie, did your thoughts or feelings about loneliness or solitude evolve over the course of editing this? Or when you went into it, were your expectations met by the process?
Yeah, you were the sort of confessor of all of our various lonelinesses.
That's true, I was. It definitely made the pandemic a lot less lonely for me, I will say. And I didn't anticipate that because I sold the book in 2019. So, but it felt like a resonant topic to me then. But it certainly felt more so a few months later once the entire world changed. But yeah, I mean, one thing that I was thinking about, there are a few things. Like I thought about with your essay, Maggie, and I think it comes up in a couple of others. In the excerpts you read, you were talking about shame, and I was thinking about. I just hadn't really thought about. There's certain types of loneliness that I hadn't actually. I mean, I guess if I had thought about it at length, maybe it would have been evident to me that but I hadn't necessarily pinned down all the different sorts of loneliness there are. But yeah, the loneliness of shame that really struck me, and I also hadn't thought about how the longing for solitude is another kind of loneliness. And that just is not, I never really put that together. But working on this, that definitely, I felt that a lot. I also just felt that personally during the pandemic, because I also just really did not have, and I'm used to having a lot of alone time and I crave it. And I mean, I like dreamt about painting like every single night for like 2 years, because I just didn't have them. I mean, my kids were just around. Like there was no time for like, I'm, setting up Zoom calls all day and making sure my kids stay in front of their screens. More screen time, So like, I just hadn't thought about that. Like, that kind of yearning.
That's an interesting way of putting it. My wife's Australian, and we went back to Australia in the middle of the pandemic, and they had a regime, as I think some countries did, where if you went into the country, they would keep you in a hotel room for 2 weeks before they would let you out into the general populace, which meant that I spent 2 weeks in a hotel room with my family, and you could not leave. There was a man in the corridor with a gun. And you could not open the door, and if you did, he would look at you sternly and then he'd close it in a big hurry. And there was that strange thing where we're just rattling around in this hotel room, and we were desperate for solitude, and we would look at each other, and we just thinking, "You can't help me. You can't give me what I need right now, and I can't give you what you need because we're stuck in this star tree." And it was, now that you mention it that way, it was extremely lonely, in spite of our enforced, being with each other.
You need an essay on that, Lev.
Yeah, we need another anthology.
Yeah, that's less like being a family and more just like being cellmates, right? Like,
yeah.
Oh, geez.
We did some hard time in Australia, definitely.
Yeah. Wasn't quite like that for me, although in a way it felt similar sometimes, we're all stuck together.
Yeah, I mean, that does seem to be maybe the most crucial distinction between solitude and loneliness, is the element of control.
Yeah.
I guess we've all talked about this in different ways, but yeah, poor Asia's heard me gripe about this so much. But so I had this travel assignment to French Polynesia in February, which I kicked off by getting COVID between the time I left the US and when I landed. So I was in quarantine for a week, which was actually kind of great. Like once everything got sorted out, I just read a book and it was amazing. But my assignment had been to go on this cruise for magazine. So I missed the first sailing. And so instead of being there for 2 weeks, I was there for a month. And this was my third attempt to do this trip. I was initially supposed to go March 2020. And all along I'd been like, I must bring a friend. Like a cruise without a friend is a nightmare. And I've done enough cruise assignments to know that. And so Asia was originally going to come, and then she was getting pregnant. And then another friend was going to come, blah, blah, blah. So my friend came with me. But then when COVID messed everything up, she had to go home to her like life and family. So I ended up going on the cruise alone, as I had been trying to avoid. But twist, I was sort of anticipating being lonely, but in fact, they assigned everyone to a table at dinner. And so I was with 5 people, one of whom was the worst person in the world. And so if I wanted to eat food, I had to eat with this person, 32 meals in a row, many of which I skipped for this reason. But it was just suddenly, the desperation for solitude was very much its own kind of loneliness. And not really having internet or a way to talk to the people I love and complain about it. There was just no outlet whatsoever. It was an incredibly lonely experience in a way that was different from what I'd been trying to circumvent by bringing a friend.
Wow.
I have so many questions about the worst person in the world. I totally believe you that you met them.
Maybe not the worst, but maybe the worst person to be at your dinner table for 11 days. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an anthology right there.
That's a good one. Yeah. The most annoying people we've ever met.
I'm not making that book. It's not happening. That one's on you.
And then it was a real struggle to write the article when I did, because I couldn't write about this aspect of it, which had, of course, totally dominated the experience. It's mean to sort of single someone out in a travel magazine as being a nightmare. yeah, so then the experience of writing it initially really felt like a lie or something, and it was really, really difficult to start doing. I felt almost panicked about it until I found kind of my way in. So I think, like these essays were for me, or I think had the potential at least to be some sort of catharsis. And when you have to write about something painful and you sort of have to write around it, it does the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a special loneliness I find with journalistic assignments. I had a really another low moment in my life was I was in the middle of getting divorced, and I took an assignment to profile J.K. Rowling, and so I flew to Edinburgh and spent a week alone in a hotel room, except for the 2 hours I spent with J.K. Rowling. That was it. That was the only conversation I had for an entire week. Were
you so anxious? Were you supposed to have more time with her?
No, you only get 2 hours with Joe.
Okay.
Joe, as I call her now that we're close friends. After 2 hours. But I was sort of already in an altered state and not fit for human company. That was a really unsuccessful. That was a real professional low for me, that whole experience.
Oh, man. Oh my gosh. I have other questions, but I'm going to click on this here and see what questions we have from other people. Let's see. Somebody has asked, I'm going to go with the second one. They wrote, did you have to set yourself apart from the feelings of being alone to write about your own loneliness? Set yourself apart from the feelings of being alone.
No, quite the opposite, I think.
Yeah.
You really have to I had to go into it.
Yeah.
Which is, not terribly fun, but I remember thinking that I was, I allowed my free association brain to go to my dad's death, which was so long ago. And I was surprised at that. And that's where the sort of third paragraph was. And I remember thinking like, okay, I need to figure out, the rest of this essay is figuring out what that connection is between those two events, between being pregnant, having lost a child, being pregnant again, and having lost a baby, and my dad's death. And that is something that I've written about before. I've written about my dad's death before, but a long time ago. And it occurred to me that it's something that that I might write about again later in life, that my perspective on it had changed from when I was, 27 and writing about it. And but it required like going in back into those days with him. And so, because I had to, it was like being an investigator of your own experience. So that was my experience of writing this piece.
That was an excellent question. I would a different perspective. I found being alone different from depression, but much like it in the sense that for me, loneliness and depression really eat words and eat language, and they cause me to. When I'm very lonely, I enter myself becomes very disorganized in a way that makes it impossible for me to kind of narrate or describe myself. For me, writing about loneliness, in a sense, I did have to take a very large step backwards in order to try to articulate what that experience was like, because the experience itself, it's like a black hole, like light could not escape and words could not escape from it. I had to step away and observe it from a bit of a distance.
Yeah, I think I had a similar experience, partly because I mean, when Natalie first contacted me, I was sort of like, well, because I was so comfortable with solitude, it was relatively rare for me to feel real loneliness. And so I ended up coming at it, like taking that big step back and identifying sort of the pressure points of when I did feel lonely and why, and the times, the sort of incidents that brought that out, which had seemed sort of previously not connected to each other and probably fundamentally aren't. But then sort of the act of trying to bind them together, and then also using sort of outside ideas about isolation. It became, I think I needed to take some distance on this idea of myself that I had as not being lonely.
Do you think your perspective on it, like, did it change as you were through the process of writing, or your thoughts on?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Or I articulated things that I'd felt, I guess, like that sense of like the incident that was in the little piece that I read with the getting the bends and having people be like, no, I wouldn't have described that as lonely until I started thinking about loneliness, and that sort of rose to the surface.
Yeah, I love that part, because I mean, I felt that way a million times in my life for so many different reasons. And I'm sure a lot of people have, but I hadn't thought about that as being a kind of loneliness either. So I really loved it that you pinned that down. I feel like that'll be helpful to so many people, I imagine, but truly. So thank you for writing that. And actually, Asia, also, I've actually gotten, I don't think I've told you this before, but I've gotten emails from readers about, I mean, probably the most have come about your essay, just because it's about something very specific that a lot of people go through and don't talk about. So I'm just very grateful to you for that.
You're muted.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying I'm not alone. Mission accomplished.
Exactly. Oh, it's so true.
Well, I think too, Asia, in your essay, you make it clear that you were trying to get out in front of the loneliness that might have happened by telling people you were pregnant when it was really early. And then it ended up not, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like, do you think you got what you were, I don't know, was it valuable to tell people so early anyway, and to have people understand know what you went through and not necessarily understand it?
I don't think I would do it the same way again, because it was, because I think the ultimate conclusion was like, well, there isn't really, there isn't the, you can't really communicate what it is, what that feels like. Even to someone who's gone through it, it's like a very private, personal experience. But I do think I would tell my friends that had happened, but I don't know that there was no comfort to be had, I think, in other people in that time, unfortunately, which we all can have experienced in some way or another.
I actually, I found also that aspect of your piece very relatable, because I experienced, had my version of that same experience, and I also told people very early, and then I was pregnant, and then I wasn't anymore, and then I had to at some point to tell them that I was not, which was hard, but. Yeah, I think I did take a lot longer to tell people the second time around. I don't know if we have time for one more. Not really, but should we? I'll see if we can end it on a different note. What time of day is your favorite time to write? That's the last question.
I like night, because I love when everybody's asleep, which has not happened since I've had a baby. So I'm having to adjust to mornings, and it's hard. But I used to I wrote my whole novel at night. I like when people are off.
Yeah. Nice.
I used to write at night, and now I get too tired. Occasionally, I'll write at night, kind of as like a second shift. But I think now I'm kind of a mid-morning's my favorite time because I don't know. Have lunch to look forward to. My brain's awake.
I mentioned the endorphin rush that accompanies drop-off for me. It's very much first thing in the morning. It's so extreme that I have to lie down for like 20 minutes on my bed and just stare at the ceiling. Occasionally play a game on my phone. And then the crucial thing is having a cup of coffee, and the first rush of caffeine, nothing better is going to happen that day. That's when it comes, and then you just try to hang on to it as long as possible.
Nice.
Wow, I'm gonna try to take that thought with me tomorrow morning into my.
That sounds great.
Yeah, it sounds
Yeah.
wonderful.
Probably I oversold it, but that's my favorite.
I think the drop off is probably the crucial piece that
I'll drop
we're
I'll go
missing.
drop
Yeah.
something off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just drop off anything. Just fling it out the window. Have the coffee. Nice. I love it. I think. Okay.
Hi, I'm back.
Hello.
Thank you guys so much. That was really inspiring and touching and
Thank you.
personal. I really,
Thanks for hosting us.
Of course, I love doing this, and I love it when I get to hear you guys tell your own stories. There's a lot of people over here that have chimed in, and they're like, "Thank you."
Mhm.
But
you
anything
so
like
much.
any last thoughts before we wrap, or?
That makes me want to read the chat, which I haven't been doing. I'll go back and do it.
Yeah.
Well, there's some thank you. There's people letting us know where they come from, and so yeah, it's been interesting to sort of see it. But listening to you guys, I got sort of absorbed in that for a minute. So, but really appreciate it, and yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All of
Thanks
you.
for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, so when I end broadcast, we're all just gonna go away. So everybody out there in the ether world, goodbye.